All right. Welcome everyone to this episode of Monetizing Your Mental Capital. I'm your host, Will Christensen, and I am actually super excited about this episode. We have Nathan Hirsch here, and many of you may have heard of Nathan. If you haven't heard of Nathan, it's because he took a little bit of a hiatus from the e-commerce space. He's back now working hard in this space, but he is the founder and successful seller of, if we're talking about monetizing mental capital, you had an idea, you built it up to a ginormous thing, and then you actually sold not only that idea, but that company to someone else. So that's a solid example of monetizing mental capital.
Yeah, I mean, you and I met during the free up days. It was a lot of fun. You and I were on the conference circuit and just running into each other. I think you were on the platform at some point, either as a client or a freelancer or both.
My first VA, I met you at a conference and we were just chatting back and forth, and you were telling me about VAs and why they were so awesome. And I was like, I don't know. Actually, one of those VAs, he's been with me for 4 years now, came off of the free up platform. We ended up buying him out eventually. And it was amazing to see him kind of lean in, and he's part of the family now. I doubt that guy will ever stop working for me.
Dude, I love it. You heard it here first. Free up non-compete is up at the end of the year. I don't know exactly what we'll do, but we're considering getting back into the space, adding a little marketplace to our portfolio. I don't think it'll be on that level, but we'll love the VA hiring space. I mean, it applies to every business owners that are good at hiring and understand delegating, just do really well. And it was a great first business. Got to meet a lot of great people like yourself.
I love it. I love it. On that note of jumping into that space, I'll be very curious. So end of this year is when that's up. So at that point, it's free game to go create something like that.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what we're going to do. I mean, it's just conversations we've had. We can always choose not to do it too. But like I said, we like the space, and it kind of complements the portfolio that we're building. It's all around boring businesses, right? I own 2 bookkeeping businesses. I own an SEO business. I have an outsource school that teaches people how to hire, but doesn't provide VAs. So it kind of goes nicely into that.
If you niche down, like Alex Hormozy, Riches in the Niches, right? If you niche down into something that was down in those spaces. I do some sourcing as well right now with Seller Labs. This is the main thing that I focus on is the podcasting, right? Outside of that, I'm actually helping overwhelmed entrepreneurs clone themselves by bringing on a young entrepreneur. So instead of bringing on just a VA to come in and tackle that stuff, because I find a lot of the entrepreneurs are actually really bad at delegating, really bad at delegating. And if you get a young entrepreneur that sees that entrepreneur as the gateway, they can give them a direction and they'll go get crap done. So you can make impact without having the SOPs defined. So niches, right? I niche down to because I was trying to clone myself, but I didn't have any SOPs. I had to figure out how to do that. And that's what I was looking for. A cloning machine that didn't work. Time machine. Oh, wait, hold on. Maybe there is somebody in college. And over 3.5 years, we've built a little bit of a gauntlet that we put young entrepreneurs through. So
I love it. We're kind of jumping all over around, but it's good. Right now, with any company we start, we won't start it unless we have an operator in place from day one. And what we look for is an entrepreneur that loves the entrepreneurship spirit. They have the same values, same ethics. They're an expert, whatever they're doing. Like you interviewed Steven, he's an expert in SEO, but usually they don't like some part of the entrepreneurial process. Like Shelia, who runs our bookkeeping businesses, she loves running a bookkeeping business. She used to run it, but she doesn't like the sales. She doesn't like the marketing. She loves managing bookkeepers and building bookkeeping processes, which is great because I'm not a bookkeeper. I couldn't do that even if I wanted to. So we try to find people like that, make them operators, make them equity holders, and then use our marketing and sales SOPs and kind of build a team around them. And then it becomes, all right, hey, we're out of fulfillment from day one. How do we support them? And how do we create a marketing funnel that pumps clients into the system? And usually we try to build a business that, like I said, is boring and applies to everyone. If you're an e-commerce seller, you need e-commerce bookkeeping. And that's what we offer at Ecom Balance. And I have a great bookkeeping team where I barely talk to the bookkeepers outside of the controller. And she makes sure stuff gets done and they do a good job. And we kind of support her with everything else. So a lot of fun ways to create a business where we're not doing everything.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love chatting through it. And, you came up and we were talking through it more. And I was like, oh, this is such a cool, that idea of finding an operator and finding someone who hates some part of the space. They're obviously an expert. but they haven't quite figured out how to turn that into and actually that was so fun to be on the podcast with Steven and a business that actually grows. I think maybe the topic of our episode, I find that they kind of come organically. And there's a few questions that I always ask. So we'll get to one of those here in a second. But I think we're going to center this a little bit around that idea of, 0 to 1, right? How do you actually build a business around an idea like this? Because I think a lot of people, man, they've got fantastic expertise, but figuring out how to monetize that in a way that actually becomes a lifestyle and or more than just a job that you own. Man, I've owned several jobs. That can be a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean, the pre-up years, and it was worth it at the end, but like I was hustling nonstop. I was working 80 hours a week, weekends, nights. I'm lucky my wife now, but girlfriend at the time didn't leave me. Like if I was getting out work call it at nights or weekend, I was taking it, going to every conference. Like it was free up 24/7. And now trying to just approach entrepreneurship differently where it's, hey, it's a portfolio of different businesses. I'm out of operations from day one. I have one central media company that does marketing for all of them, one central billing that does marketing or billing for all of them, and just like approach it differently. Like now I'm retired from conferences. I don't go to any conferences, don't work after 3:00. I don't work weekends. I have a son now, like trying to create a business that kind of fits your lifestyle. And the only way to do that is with the strong process, the delegating, the operators and all the stuff there. But there's a time and a place to hustle too. Like it was completely worth it for me to do it for 4 years. Changed my life, changed my business partner, Connor's life. And you learn so much when you actually like have to grind and don't have like a fallback plan. Like now, if all my businesses went under, it would suck a lot, but I'll be fine. Back then, if Free Up went under, I would have had to go out and get a real job or something. So just kind of perspective of where you are for life and putting in that time, but making sure you have an end game and long-term, making sure you're building businesses that have diversity, have great people, allow you to actually live a life. Probably where I disagree with Alex Hormozi, where he's just like, hey, all I do is work and watch Netflix a little bit. And that's like my 1 hour break every day. To me, like that's not sustainable. Most people can't do that. And that's no way to kind of live life. So I don't know about work-life balance, but that's kind of how I approach it compared to when I was 25 and you and I first met.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a fantastic segue here. So thinking back to when you were 25 and maybe even going farther back, when's the first time you can remember monetizing your mental capital? So a lot of people share stories like lemonade stand stories, or, I sold candy bars out of my locker in college or high school, or, all sorts of different stuff like that. When's the first time you can remember monetizing mental capital?
Yeah, I have a lot of failed lemonade stands and stuff, but my stream wasn't busy. So all those kind of didn't really do much. Really, it was kind of what you and I were chatting about but before. When I was in college and I was a broke college kid trying to make extra side money, and this company came to my dorm room and tried to buy my textbooks and offered me nothing for them. And I went on Amazon and saw that I could sell them for a little bit more to Amazon. And I kind of went to all my friends and said, hey, I'll sell your books and I'll just take a cut. And then before I knew it, I was running this textbook business out of my college dorm room using Book Scouter, selling all these textbook companies, had an Amazon account that I was selling on, created a referral program for students to go out and get me books. And I had lines out the door of people trying to sell me books at the end of every semester. And I got a cease and desist letter from my college because I was taking too much of their bookstore's business. So that was my first like, hey, I'm actually making real money and I have extra money and all of that. And when I finally got that cease and desist letter, that's what led me to Amazon, because I had this Amazon seller account. No one knew what Amazon was. I said, hey, I don't really have a lot of money to buy inventory. I don't have a place to put inventory, can't sell textbooks anymore. And that's how I got into drop shipping and reaching out to other manufacturers. And before I knew it, I was running a pretty large Amazon business out of my college dorm room. So that was my first real entrepreneurial adventure.
I love that. So Nathan, and right before we hit the record button, Nathan and I were talking about this a little bit. Our origin stories as far as entrepreneurship intertwine dramatically. So I also got not a cease and desist letter, but I got a nice little phone call from, it was like the dean of something at University of Georgia. And he said, you are no longer welcome on campus. No, I had already graduated from college. I was actually living in Watkinsville, Georgia, near Athens, Georgia. And the reason I was there was because I went to go work for Book Scouter. Brandon Checkitz, who's the founder of Seller Labs, had created Book Scouter almost by accident. And I don't know if you know his origin story at all. Basically, Brandon was sitting in his living room and his wife's roommate or friend from years before came and was like, "Oh, I'm trying to sell these textbooks." And so she had like 7 different tabs open and she was checking all these different places she could sell the textbooks. And Brandon's a programmer. And he looked at that and said, "Wait a second. I could make it so that you have one place that you go to and I'll scrape all of those buyback prices all at once." That was the first version of Book Scouter. That's all it was. It was just a little scraper that went in and connected those dots. And he was right time, right place, first mover, and built a multi-million-dollar business just comparing textbook prices. Well, that grew into more stuff. He brought in his brother Dustin Checkets. His brother Dustin knew me, brought me out there, and I worked my butt off to try to figure out how to impress Brandon because I was trying to figure out how to get into the entrepreneur game myself. And so it's interesting to hear, in some ways, Brandon Checkets helped you start your entrepreneurial career by creating Book Scouter to create a true arbitrage business there, which led you to Amazon. And that's actually the same thing that happened. That's how Selly Labs started. Selly Labs they were buying and selling books like crazy, pallets of books. And Brandon was like, "Wait a minute, I actually don't think I love selling books." Like we had a huge warehouse, all sorts of stuff. And he was like, "I think I like the software." And so they started leaning into the software. And that's where Selly Labs came from. So Book Scouter spawned, multiple businesses as it kind of got rolling there. And hilarious that you got a cease and desist and I got a cease and desist phone call because I was selling books in front of the bookstore using a club. I had figured out how to get a club involved and we're doing a fundraiser for them and all that kind of stuff. And they were not thrilled that we were picking up books in front of the bookstore at all.
Yeah, dude, it's funny how each business builds on each other. Like I went textbooks and then Amazon taught me how to hire and that led me to Free Up. And then even at Free Up, we created a really good billing system and bookkeeping was a big part of it and helping us pass due diligence, which led us to a bookkeeping company. And we had to learn marketing for the first time because we didn't have Amazon customers and that led us to SEO. So we went an SEO business. So every business kind of piles on each other and things you learn, you kind of just see opportunities to say, "Hey, how can I take what's working for me and offer it to other people?"
No, 100%. And what you just described is the premise of this podcast, monetizing your mental capital, i.e. taking what's working for me and selling it to other people. And going from that 0 to 1 is a huge part of that challenge, right? Like how to take that process. And so the first podcast I've had you on, because this is number 2, the first podcast I had you on when I was back at Data Automation was called Automate, Delegate, Eliminate. And one day I'll write a book. It's going to be called Automate, Delegate, Eliminate. And my journey has also mirrored that because that's where I started was all automation. Like that's all I did all day long was automate stuff. But I was actually pretty poor in the delegation space. So I want to kind of dig into that a little bit with you, Nathan. From the standpoint of delegation, what do you think the biggest roadblocks are? Like, why is it that I have this thing that works for me? I figured out how to sell it to other people, but now I got to scale beyond me. And that seems to be such a difficult task for so many. What do you think it is about delegation that trips people up?
Yeah, entrepreneurs have this trust factor. They're hesitant to trust other people. I can't tell you how many people I talk to that are like, "Oh, I could never pass on bookkeeping, or I can never pass on finance or billing or something like that." And it's crazy. Like there's no large entrepreneurs. Like Brandon's not doing his own bookkeeping. Like that's just not how business works. So there's so many things inside your business that you're just not going to be able to do at scale. And it's always going to hold you back. And the other side of it is there's just people out there that can do things way better than you. Most entrepreneurs are not that organized, or they might not be good at sales, or they're not good at have marketing or ads or whatever it is. So normal entrepreneurs, they're only good at 2 or 3 things. They might have the ideas and the motivation, but skill-wise, only a handful. So the good entrepreneurs, they realize, hey, I'm going to focus on what I'm good at. And down the line, I'll even delegate that. And I'm going to surround myself with people that can do all the other things that I don't want to do. Or they say, hey, I'm going to master something and be able to pass it off. Like I have a 3-month rule where if I'm building a process, I'll test it out. I'll do it myself. I'll be consistent about it. But the end goal is for it to be off my plate. We just hired a CEO of our media company. I've been posting social media content for the past year, built some processes. Now I'm hiring someone who's way smarter than me. You can take my process and then hopefully up them from there. So that's where I think people struggle. They don't want to trust other people. They think, hey, they're going to steal my ideas. They're going to hurt my business. They're not going to do as good job as me. I have to do this forever. And it's really the complete opposite if you ever want to grow.
Interesting. So we've got this trust factor as entrepreneurs. Do you think that comes from, have we watched too many movies where somebody, came in and stole an idea? Or what is it that makes us inherently not interested in trusting someone else? Because I came that way. For me, it was trauma, right? Like if I'm answering that question for myself, why did you have a hard time trusting people? I lost my mom when I was 10 years old from breast cancer. And it was crazy how often, especially females, would come into my life and they were working on the business with me. And I didn't even realize it at the time. This is called a transference. It's actually a legit psychological, if you go to a therapist, you talk about transference, it's in the textbook. And the textbook definition is I take an experience from someone in the past and I transfer it onto someone now that I'm currently working with or that I've connected with. And for me, I can't tell you the number of times I would get in and I would fear delegating for fear they were going to abandon me or leave me, which you think about it, someone leaving a job is not an abandonment. That's normal, right? There's going to be turnover. There's going to be shifts. But I was so scared of that. I just created all sorts of problems for myself. So for me, I've got some trauma that led into that. I mean, is it trauma for everyone? What do you think, based on your experience with all these entrepreneurs who you helped delegate, what is it that causes that lack of trust?
Yeah, business is hard. Hiring people is hard. You make a bad hire and it can be something that you're just like, hey, I never want to do this again. Hiring is not for me. And I almost look at it more big picture. Let's say you gave someone access to your bank account and they stole $5,000 from you, which sucks. But if your mentality is I can never trust anyone to invoice my clients ever again, you're going to lose way more than $5,000 over the life of your business. And it's the same thing on a smaller level. You hire someone, you train them for 3 months, they quit on you. They do a terrible job and you lose a client because of it. But you have to learn that if you want to grow, you have to be able to hire and you have to get better from each process. That's why we created an outsource school to kind of take our hiring process and plug it into your business. But what we did at the beginning is we said, hey, every time we have a bad hire, how do we put steps in place to prevent that from ever happening again? So we started to improve our process for attitude, improve our vetting for skill, focus on hiring people with better communication. And over time, we make rockstar hires. And those rockstar hires, that becomes addictive. You're like, oh my God, I want to hire more people. I want to take more off my plate. This frees up my time. That my business is growing versus the bad hires that make you never want to trust anyone again. So you almost have to go in knowing, hey, if you're a brand new entrepreneur, you're going to make bad hires. No one just starts hiring great people right away. Maybe you get lucky like I did with my business partner, Connor. Here and there, you get some lucky breaks, but you have to know that bad hiring is part of the process. And the key is to get rid of bad people as quickly as possible, as early as possible, and to not let it hold you back where 2 years down the line, you're stuck doing everything and working long hours and not delegating because you had one bad hiring experience a long time ago.
That's fascinating. So just while you were talking there, I was just Googling a little bit. And there's all sorts of different statistics that are running around here. One says over 80% of new hires fail. Another one saying it's 48%. Another one that I've come across that says even Google only does better than, 50, just better than 50%. So we are naturally bad at hiring. I think this is probably some of the root cause here, because you go after this is a normal process. I know how to recruit people. I know how to get people to do stuff. They get on, have a bad experience and another bad experience. And they just are yeah, never mind. This is not a skill I want to learn.
To me, hiring is the first skill you should learn. I mean, hiring, they don't teach it at school, but it makes everything else easier in business. If you know how to hire, it makes up for all the other skills. A lot of people will go out and they'll try to take a bookkeeping course and a PPC course and all these different things, which is crazy. You can't become an expert at everything. If you just know how to hire, anytime you have a weakness, if there's a fire, if there's a project that needs to be done, if all of a sudden the workload increases, you always have that in your back pocket and it just makes everything else easier going forward.
Okay, so that's fascinating because I've talked to a lot of people about different parts of that journey of like figuring out what's out there and deciding, what's the most important. And a lot of people on this podcast even have said that the most important skill is sales. They're like, you've got to learn to sell. You've got to learn to sell. And as you were saying that, I think the most important skill, as you were saying, is that ability to hire. And I thought, if I have enough runway, even if I have a moderate amount of runway, like let's say, calling mom and dad, calling aunts and uncles and being like, hey, will you invest in my business? If I can create a moderate amount of runway for myself and I'm a fantastic hirer, I can solve the sales problem.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, sales is a good skill to have too, right? Most entrepreneurs, they're not getting funding and they're not getting investment. So be able to sell and prove an idea and talk to your customers and tweak the sales pitch, which you did a really good job at free up. There's benefits to that. And for most entrepreneurs, sales is probably the last thing that you delegate. Not always. Sometimes you can go in and you're able to hire those salespeople. But yeah, hiring, like if you can't hire, it's always going to hold you back. If selling is not your thing, you stink at it, you're never going to get better at it. You can always hire a salesperson.
So tell me, Nathan, so e-commerce seller, 9-figure seller, 8-figure seller, 7-figure seller comes to you and says, Nate, I have this amazing idea. It's working for me. I wanted to sell it to someone else, but I know I don't have the skill set to go do this. I don't have the skill set to monetize this mental capital. Like I've got this juicy piece of mental capital. And they're like, I have enough money to buy a course on one thing. I don't have enough money to buy a course on two things. I'm trying to decide between a course on hiring and a course on sales. Which are you going to tell them to go tackle?
Yeah, assuming they're bad at both, hiring every single day. Because hiring, again, you can just be the idea person and surround yourself with really good people and have a business take off. And there's plenty of entrepreneurs who they're good salespeople or they're good entrepreneurs in the sense they come up with good ideas, but hiring always holds them back and they're not able to scale their business. And even turnover alone, if you're constantly going through turnover, your business is never going to scale. Turnover crushes small businesses, sets you back months, 6 months, a year. So you have to be able to hire. Hiring is step number one.
Okay. So you would definitely say hiring. I love that. And I agree with you. I think that you've shifted my perspective a little bit there because I would have said sales up until this call. And the reason I would have said sales is, well, if you don't have sales, you don't have any money to hire somebody else. But I think that's a fallacy. I think you really are underestimating. Like if we think about sales and we think about things that are working for me, we all have a circle of influence where there's like 15 to 20 people who've had enough experience with you that it actually doesn't matter that you suck at sales. You can call them up and be like, hey, you also run an Amazon business. I've got this idea. It's been working for me. How about we work on it? That wasn't a good sales pitch, but a lot of times those sorts of individuals, because you have enough trust, will buy in. And so at that point, you've got enough money rolling through that you can start, digging in on the hiring side and bringing in a true salesperson to start convincing people you don't already know.
Yeah. And again, there's multiple ways to start a business. Sales, it does cure all, right? If you can get sales, everything else you can figure out. And I do kind of preach that and practice that in my companies, right? Like for Free Up, we gave out a bunch of free hours of VAs and said, hey, you'll be our beta clients, give us feedback. And if we couldn't give away hours of VAs or they didn't keep their VAs afterwards, we didn't have a business. Same thing with bookkeeping, gave away 2 free months of bookkeeping. With Outdoor School, we sold our hiring course before we even made it and said, hey, is there a market? Great. We sold a bunch. Now we'll go out and actually make the course. So I do believe in that approach. But again, if you can only have one or the other, hiring, you can always hire salespeople. And if you're going to only focus on sales and only have that skill set, you better have a business partner or a hiring manager or someone else that's going to be able to build that team and build that fulfillment process.
As I'm trying to decide about hiring, and you've said, no, learn the hiring skill. That is really the one that goes down there. What would you say, especially on the realm of non-physical goods? So we're talking about info courses, we're talking about SaaS products, we're talking about service-based businesses. If you're focused on that sort of business that you want to build, and your first hires are going to be individuals, maybe it's customer service, could be a sales guy, could be someone a programmer, right? All of these different things kind of come in there. What can I avoid in my hiring process? Like if I was like, hey, Nate, Okay, I believe you. Hiring's what I got to learn. Where am I going to make the most mistakes?
It's usually around onboarding and setting expectations. So, I mean, at Outsource School and the hiring process that we use, we break it up into interviewing, onboarding, training, and managing. Interviewing, it's all about finding someone with that skill, attitude, communication. Onboarding is all about setting expectations and holding them to the expectations. Training is about SOPs and really how to improve themselves before you load them up with tasks. And then managing is how do you keep them motivated? How do you handle issues that come up, bonuses, raises, all that. So where most entrepreneurs go wrong is that onboarding. How do you actually prepare someone for what they're getting into before they start? Because I saw this at FreeUp all the time. Someone would post a job, they talk to the VA, they hire the VA, and the VA would get started on day one and be like, this is not at all what we talked about. This is not what I was expecting. Or there'd be different gaps. Like someone would train a VA and then be like, hey, I'm going to add in Time Doctor and monitor your screen all the time. And the VA said, what? Like, you never brought this up. This wasn't discussed. There was no expectations. And both sides are in a bad spot because the VA doesn't want the screen monitor and wouldn't have accepted the job. And the client already invested a lot of time into training the VA. And if you think of the issues people have with VAs, all those horror stories of the VA disappearing, power issues, internet issues, computer issues, personal issues, all of that gets solved if you set really good expectations and onboard them. And what we teach at Outsource School, our SICK method, which is schedule, issues, communication, and culture. After we have a good interview, but before they start, we go through all these things and we have a checklist. Hey, if your computer goes down, is there a backup computer in your house? Do you have a backup generator? Is there anything in your personal life that's going to stop from interfering with work? Stuff like that. And this kind of gets ahead of everything. And then you can hold them to those expectations once they start. So if you can kind of take anything from this, or you're trying to improve your hiring process from where it is right now, focus on how do I set great expectations with people and hold them to it from the beginning. That's where a lot of entrepreneurs mess up.
Had you asked me just out of the blue, like, hey, Will, where do you think they mess up? Number one place I would have said that they mess up is in that interviewing process, because I've seen so many people just hire people like them and not create any real tests. At Data Automation, for example, I brought on interns and we had one guy come on and he turned to my developer and he said, okay, so what's a for loop? And I was like, uh-oh, we have reached a new level of intern here. This intern is now officially going to be net negative on our return, because it doesn't matter how little I'm paying him, my dev is now teaching him to code, and he can't even do some of the basic tasks that were there. So we made a dev test. So we made a basic example of like the sort of thing that people would have to do when they were inside Data Automation. And this is the sort of thing that like we ran into all the time. We made it basic enough that an intermediate dev should be able to do it really easy, and an expert dev would do it in their sleep. And a beginner dev might struggle with it, but if they had the aptitude, they could pass it. So that was kind of our skill level. And so we put that into our interview process, where if they passed some of our like, okay, we like this person, culture seems to fit, now go do this thing that has nothing to do with how much I like you. It's very objective in terms of, can you pass my test? And that worked really well. We immediately saw a change in the people that were coming through. And man, were we glad when we saw the results of that thing of like who we didn't hire. So I would have said testing. Why? Obviously you've got tons of experience of watching entrepreneurs do it wrong. What is it in your past experience that has taught you that it's all about expectation setting?
Yeah, I mean, your time matters the most. The last thing you want to do is invest a lot of time into someone and then realize they don't work out. So yeah, all that interview stuff is great. Obviously, interviewing is important. Tests are great. But if the expectation that I set with a new hire is, hey, we're hiring you to be a developer. We're hiring you to hit the ground running. We can't be teaching you developing. Like if you're starting week one, you're coding, you're building stuff. And in week one, that's not happening. You set that expectation. You're holding them to that expectation. You know it's not a fit, and you move on. So it goes hand in hand, but the expectation is what allows you to actually like pull the plug quickly.
I think what you just pointed out to me is even that clear expectation setting teaches you what tests you need to be putting in play. For me, I hadn't obviously set proper expectations with this intern who came in and turned to my dev and said, what's a for loop? Because when he did that, he obviously thought that he was going to get training on the job for basic coding skills. Well, that was never a proper expectation. So like in that onboarding first call sort of situation, he had already been with us for like 2 or 3 weeks. So how much other time and effort and energy had been wasted in that process. And then we really wasted it when we had to let him go and say, hey, come back in a couple semesters when you've spent more time coding, because this isn't the minimum we need for someone in your position.
Yeah. I mean, the sooner you're able to get rid of people that are not a fit, the better. That's what separates really good entrepreneurs on the hiring side and not. We had a situation years ago where we hired a bookkeeper. They requested an interview. We set expectations. And one of the expectations was you're full-time and you're exclusive to us. You cannot have any other bookkeeping clients. And she agreed to that. In week 1, we caught her working for another client. We could have kind of gone a bunch of different routes, but it was pretty easy. Like, hey, we set that expectation. You broke the trust. We're moving on. And there we go. It would have been way worse if we had loaded her up with clients and then still had that issue down the line. So the expectations and holding them to it are so important. That's your job with any new hire. It's how do I figure out if this person is an A player and can meet my expectations in as short a time as possible?
So on that note, what is your methodology around letting people go with this individual, for example? And this is part of where my trauma got involved, right? Because I was like, oh, I can't let her go. I'm abandoning her. And if I abandon her, then she'll abandon me. Luckily I've done some therapy. We've made it through that. So my emotional state doesn't affect that anymore. So I know that that's one thing that gets in the way of that side of it. And I highly recommend therapy to whoever, if you're finding yourself in an emotional state there that's not allowing you to make that change, dig into that side of it.
Yeah. So the way we fire people, we always try to end on good terms, and we try not to give too much detail because we don't want to get into a back and forth over specific like client situations. Like you said this email wrong or whatever it is. So, I mean, for this particular person, we were just upfront and honest, like, hey, this is our expectation. This is what we care about. And you kind of broke the trust, and things this early on, we're just going to part ways. We wish you nothing but the best and try to keep the conversation as short as possible while removing their access while we're on the calls. We have someone on our team doing that. Now, if that blew up, we've had situations, luckily not many, where someone is out of their mind, right? We know they're going to handle it poorly. They're going to yell, they're going to reach out to clients, stuff like that. The best thing to do is just block them on all channels and let the team know. But if you have to, like in my back pocket, it's, hey, we're going to give you a severance. It's going to be $500, $200, whatever the number is. But we're going to break it out over 6 months. We're going to give you $50 a month for 6 months. If you reach out to me, if you reach out to my team, if you reach out to any of our clients, the payments stop right away. And if they want to go crazy and do stuff, whatever, you email your clients, you let them know, people understand. Most of the time, they're just going to take the money and leave you alone. And in 6 months, they're going to have other clients and not be thinking about you and really have cooled down, which is what most people do. So that's always there. But the most realistic thing is you part ways, they get another job, everyone moves on, and you end on good terms.
And with this individual who broke trust that early, it wasn't like you did a bunch of strikes or anything like that. Like I've heard like the 3 strike rule. What is your mentality around, how much leeway you give a person in that role?
Yeah. So it's a combination of whether you think they're going to be an A player and how long they've been with you at the company. So the less likely they are to be an A player or the least they've been with the company, that's when you move the fastest. You probably met Marius back in the free up days, right?
Oh, yeah.
Marius is the absolute best. So clearly an A player with us for years. There was like one point at year 3 where for like 2 months, he was like struggling for some reason. He was making a bunch of billing mistakes, paying people wrong. And we were like, what's happening? And like, obviously if that had happened in week 1 with a bookkeeper that we had hired to run our own company, probably would have parted ways. This was an all-star we really liked 3 years in. So we sat down and tried to figure out what was wrong. And it turned out he just needed a break. So we gave him 2 weeks off and he came back and he crushed it from that point forward. So not everything is, hey, you made this mistake, you're fired. But if you're making mistakes early on, you can find someone else who's not going to make those mistakes early on. And it's a pretty high risk. And the other factor, like we talked to our team and keeping experience wise, she probably had potential to be a B+ player. If it was an A player, maybe we give another leash. But again, it's week 1. If it was 6 months in and they were going to be an A player, maybe give more room. there's no perfect formula, but those are kind of the two factors that you have to keep in mind. Because if you're just giving a B player chance after chance after chance after chance, that's not where
you're wasting money.
Be. Exactly. Or if they're pretty early on in the process and you haven't invested time and they're not showing up and they're having personal issues or whatever it is, that's a pretty good sign to just find someone else who's going to hit the ground running.
I love it. I love it. Okay. So shifting to one of the other questions we ask in all of these episodes, if you could make a phone call back to Nate, and this is Nate, he's got a line out the flipping door at his dorm room, right? He's just finished up for the night. He's in a spot where he actually can take some advice. The phone rings, he picks it up, and you're like, hey, Nate, this is Nate from the future. I literally am you. And how long ago was that? That was probably
2008, 2009.
2009. Okay. So we're talking about 16 years ago. So, hey, Nate, this is Nate 16 years from now. I've got some advice for you on how to monetize your mental capital better. And here's the advice. What advice would you give him?
Build Amazon software. that was the move back in the day, right? Like I was a big seller. You got options. You either double down on selling and you go more like private label and what was working there. You do more like teaching, courses, memberships, conferences, whatever. Or you build software like the Seller Labs, like Helium 10s and whatever. Or you go do something crazy like we did and start a freelance marketplace, which I probably think was the second best option. And I have no regrets there. It worked out great. But the best option was definitely the software. If you look at the Helium 10s of the world that had even bigger exits than we had at FreeUp, that was the most lucrative. And at the time, Connor and I actually laid out all the options and we went with the freelance marketplace. So I think it worked out, and maybe we would have built crappy software that couldn't have competed or whatever. But I think the real play there was the software.
Interesting. So you'd tell him to take one opportunity over another. What about a general piece of advice that wasn't as specific, like, hey, Connor's going to lay out some different options here. And when he lays out those options, go with the software. I think that's totally relevant. And I think it's actually an interesting piece of monetizing mental capital because I think a SaaS business is very interesting. Any other general piece of advice that you'd give him?
Yeah, the hiring operators, kind of like what we do now. I mean, I was definitely towards the end of FreeUp, I was out of fulfillment, but the first few years, like I knew nothing about running that kind of business. I'd only run an Amazon business. I had no corporate experience. So getting someone in fulfillment a lot faster than I did, and then investing more into the FreeUp software. For the first few years of FreeUp, I think you helped us with the FreeUp software.
Oh, yeah.
Did. Like, it was crummy. It did very little. It was the last thing people thought about. By the end, it got pretty good and it became a big part of the sale and all that. But if we had just doubled down and put more profits into the software, I think we would have grown even faster than we did.
I actually like that. The general advice there is invest in automation, i.e. software. And that could mean either way, right? Like either in building a SaaS business or in building a SWAS business is what I've heard a lot of people call it, a service or a software-enabled service business. So where you're using software to make those processes continue forward. I love that. All right. So final two questions here for you. The second to last question is, you've stepped into an elevator. The guy next to you is like, yeah, I'm an 8-figure Amazon seller. And you can ask him any question you want. You can tell him about any of these different businesses you've got. So you've got 60 seconds to do that. And then right after that, I want you to share any tips, tricks, hacks, or books you've come across in the last year that have helped you upscale your ability to monetize mental capital. So, got my timer out. You've stepped into the elevator. Guy next to you turns and says, yeah, I'm an 8-figure Amazon seller. What do you do?
I run a portfolio of companies that help e-commerce and online businesses. One that's probably relevant to this guy is Ecom Balance, my monthly bookkeeping service for e-commerce sellers. Cool thing about us is we're built by sellers for sellers. So a lot of bookkeepers, they struggle with the stuff around bookkeeping, whether it's customer service, valuing the client's time, systems, processes, hiring, scaling, and those are things that we're good at. And yeah, that's kind of my pitch if they're looking for bookkeeping help. And I would ask them a lot about just how they were able to grow the business and compete with other people in a pretty crowded space right now. And if anyone wants a great podcast to check out, My First Million, they just talk about a lot of great ideas for building businesses. It's kind of a fun podcast. Get the behind the scenes of just entrepreneurs with crazy ideas that did a really good job of executing them. And it gives you a lot of ideas how to take that and apply it to whatever ideas you have.
Beautiful. Man, you did that whole thing in 60 seconds. Any other tips, tricks, hacks, or books that you'd recommend? My First Million is great, by the way. I enjoy that one.
Yeah, I mean, coming from a guy running a bookkeeping business, focus on your bookkeeping. Like for me, my Amazon business, I ignored bookkeeping. I dumped it on my CPA. I had no idea how I was doing. Free up, one of the best decisions I've ever made in my entire life in all my companies was hiring Marius from day one of Free Up. Before we were profitable, before we proved the idea, it helped us make great decisions every single month. And when we went to sell the business, we had 4 years of immaculate books that helped us pass due diligence. And bookkeeping is boring. No one wants talking about it. You shouldn't be taking a course on bookkeeping. You shouldn't be doing it yourself. You don't even need to know how to use QuickBooks, but you need a good monthly bookkeeping process. And if I can help with that in any way, just reach out to me.
I love it. Well, that's our episode here. Thank you, Nathan, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.